During World War II, American forces engaged the Japanese military among the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska. Often referred to as the Forgotten War of the Aleutians, the campaign was an effort to stop the advance of the Japanese toward North America. Had it not been for the courageous efforts of American servicemen, the Japanese would have gained a foothold on American soil. On February 5, 1945, a young pilot in the Army Air Corps, Captain Art Kidder, was flying a mission over the Bering Sea when he was forced to crash land his P-38 Lightning on Buldir Island, a small pinpoint of land at the western tip of the Aleutian Island chain. Although Captain Kidder suffered only minor injuries, his aircraft could not be salvaged. For 50 years, it has been exposed to the harsh elements on Buldir Island. In August 1994, the Air Force Heritage Foundation of Utah sent a team of men from the 405th Combat Logistics Support Squadron and the 67th Aerial Port Squadron from Hill Aerospace, Utah, to Buldir Island in order to recover Captain Kidder's P-38 and return it home for restoration. Now a retired lieutenant colonel, Art Kidder was contacted at his home in Aurora, Colorado, and offered the chance to accompany the team on the recovery mission. Also with the team were several members of the Air Force Heritage Foundation: retired Major General Rex Hadley, retired Lieutenant General Mark Reynolds, retired Colonel Don Pantone, and Mr. John Lindquist.
The Wyoming Air National Guard provided a C-130H model to transport us up to Adak Island for this mission. They flew down here and picked us up at the ramp at Hill Air Force Base. We loaded all of our equipment onto the airplane with the help of the aircraft crew. We departed Hill Air Force Base around 11 o'clock in the morning. We flew directly from here up to Kodiak Island, where the crew went into crew rest. We spent the night there. We got up the next morning and loaded back onto the aircraft. We flew out to Adak Island.
The first team arrived at Adak Naval Air Facility on Adak Island, Alaska. There, the team transferred their equipment to a salvage ship named Polar Bear, waiting in Kuluk Bay.
The Navy people who are assigned the responsibility of taking care of the Naval Air Station up there provided us with trucks and equipment, cranes, to haul all of our equipment from the airfield to the docks where the ship was waiting. We got into a bus that the Navy provided us. We drove up to the dining hall. We had a good hot meal there, thinking that this was going to be the last time in a week that we were going to have a good, nice, warm meal. One thing that we realized when we got up to the dining hall is the Air Force definitely provides better meals than the Navy does. We had a good, nice meal there, and we got back on the bus and we drove down to the docks, and there we proceeded to load all of our equipment onto the ship. When we got to the docks, we utilized the cranes that were on the ship to load the pallets with all of our equipment, tools, and all of our gear onto the boat from the docks. Because most of us weren't familiar with sailing in the open ocean and procedures for safety that are required there, we were given extensive briefings by the crew showing us how to use the life preservers. They had what they call Mustang suits that are fully coverable suits that you put over you. So if you do go in the water, they'll maintain your body heat and you won't suffer hypothermia. You can survive in the water up to 8 hours, they say, in those Mustang suits. Once we had all of our equipment and gear loaded on the ship in Adak Harbor, we set sail. We had to consequently pass through a passageway in between Adak Island and another island to get on the south side, or the northern Pacific Ocean. From there we transited on our way to Buldir Island.
The 120-foot Polar Bear left Adak Island on August 25th, steering a course to Buldir Island. The first night, the ship encountered rough seas with 15-foot waves.
The swells were way higher than the boat was, and the skipper of the boat decided that those seas were too rough to continue sailing throughout the night. So he found a safe harbor in order to anchor for the night, and then we spent the night there. And the next morning we got up to calmer seas, calmer than the night before. These seas were roughly 5 to 8 feet tall. Being a flat-bottom boat, the boat wouldn't cut through the water like a normal boat would. There's a flat bottom, so it would ride the crest of the waves up and down. So it made for an awful rough ride.
The ship's captain, Peter Schwartz, skillfully guided the Polar Bear through rough seas and safely made harbor at Kiska Island.
We arrived there late in the evening after dark, and we dropped anchor in Kiska Harbor and spent the night there. The next morning we woke up before dawn, around 0600, and we could view some of the ships that were sunk in the harbor during the Aleutian War and the campaign there, where B-24 bombers that were sent from Adak Island were bombing the harbor because the Japanese were entrenched there and had invaded that island. When we woke up in the morning and went out and looked at those ships, it wasn't very light yet, and all we could see was the ghostly silhouette of the ships. We couldn't see very much of a detail. As it became lighter, we were there for approximately 45 minutes before we set sail. We could see a lot of the details on the ships, the holes in them, the damage that was done. And so you could feel a sense of regret for those Japanese sailors that were on those ships and what they had to have experienced from the bombing of those airplanes and the casualties that accrued from that.
The following morning, August 27th, brought moderate seas which remained until the team made landfall at Buldir Island.
When the ship dropped anchor just off the beach on Buldir Island, of where we knew the aircraft to be, Peter Schwartz, the captain of the ship, drove the ship up onto the beach and dropped the bow onto the beach. So we were able to take our gear directly from the boat onto the island without having to go in the water. After we broke down all of our gear, all of our equipment onto the beach, all of us took a minute and we walked up over the top of the sand berm that was there on the beach, and we went up to where the aircraft was. We took the pilot with us, Art Kidder, and it was very interesting watching him. We let him go first. Watching the expression on his face of seeing his aircraft again after 50 years of being away from it.
The amount of memories it brings back keep you awake all night so you don't get much sleep. But it really is a fantastic experience to get back here and see what happened to the airplane. I'm kind of disappointed it got beat up so bad through malicious type of stuff, and I don't know who did it or when, but I guess after 50 years, why, you got to expect that type of thing.
The plane was in terrible condition, being the victim of countless strafings by American pilots needing a convenient target on which to practice their skills. Nevertheless, the parts which remained were deemed recoverable and would be salvaged for restoration.
We knew previously, before we went on this trip, how far the aircraft was away from the boat and the beach. We knew what it was going to take to get the pieces from the crash site to the aircraft. We took up Air Force cargo pallets, which are metal pallets, that we could put the parts of the airplane on and drag them to the boat. We also took up approximately a mile of 7/8" cable that we used. We brought all of the pallets and the cable from the boat and took them to the aircraft site, where we proceeded to dismantle the aircraft.
The team spent the next several days dismantling the plane. A metal cutting saw was used to separate the wings, tail boom, fuselage gondola, and engines.
Once we got to the aircraft, we had initially hoped that we could disassemble it by undoing the bolts, the wing attach fittings, and take it out piece by piece. But once we got to the aircraft and saw the severe corrosion that was inherent from all those years sitting in that tundra and the moist, salty conditions, we realized that it was going to be physically impossible to undo any of the bolts because they were totally rusted and welded to the frame. So we had a crash recovery saw, which is called a K-12 saw, that we'd brought along with us just in case this transpired. When we cut the top of the wing, we didn't have any difficulties because we could stand on the wing and use the saw to cut through the wing. But when we were underneath it, you had to turn the saw upside down. The exhaust from the saw, when it's upside down, would blow right directly into your face. But that's the only way that we could do it, being underneath the airplane.
As each part was removed, it was loaded onto a pallet and strapped down. A steel cable attached to a winch on the Polar Bear was used to drag the parts, sometimes 3 at a time, down to the beach.
When we had all the pieces there, We had people that could carry out the parts that were lightweight. They carried them out by hand to the boat. So we didn't have that far to bring the airplane off, only 300 yards. With the cable that we used and the pallets that we used to carry the heavy parts, such as both engines, the propellers, the nose section, we put them on the flat metal pallets and hooked the cable onto those pallets, and we winched it from the crash site onto the boat.
Along the way, the pallets had to be dragged over streams, thick knee-high grass, and flotsam that had washed onto the beach over the years. The beach was littered with 20-foot logs and 4x4 wooden beams lost from freighters and barges.
We utilized these to make makeshift bridges over the streams and down through all the flotsam and jetsam and lumber that was on the beach that had been washed up and piled up on the beach. This made it a lot easier pulling it over that. We also had many rocks, large rocks that were on the beach, and we used the lumber to kind of soften the blow or even the trail that we were pulling these pallets on.
Sometimes members had to sit on the rear of the pallet to weigh it down. This prevented the front of the pallets from hanging up on the grass or becoming buried in the sand.
We were concerned about the weight of the engines. They weighed quite a bit, and with the cable that we were using to pull it off the island with, we were concerned about the cable breaking and someone being in the way. So we were trying to be very careful on the very first few pulls and being real safe, but we realized that the winches and the cable would pull those parts off the island easily, and the strength of the cable was more than sufficient to pull it. Then we were a little bit more free with pulling the items off. We doubled up on some of the pallets, and we only had to pull 2 or 3 times the amount of equipment off the island at one time versus just 1 pallet at a time. We pulled the items directly from the crash site directly onto the boat. There were times, though, that we encountered throughout the 3 days that we were on the island that the surf got relatively high, approximately 4 to 5 feet, and loading those pallets with the parts on it from the sandy beach onto the ramp with all the surf became quite enjoyable. Many people got soaked, many people got wet, and the surf played havoc with the pallets.
After the parts had been loaded onto the ship, the team members spent time cleaning up around the crash site and digging for any parts they may have missed. With all their gear and the P-38 loaded onto the ship, Captain Swartz raised the front ramp and backed the polar bear away from the shore. With a healthy blast of the foghorn, the recovery team bade farewell to Buldir Island. Upon returning to Adak Island, the P-38 was loaded piece by piece onto the docks. The parts were washed to remove any salt water, which could cause corrosion. The P-38 was loaded aboard a C-141 and transported to Dulzura, California, where it was restored by Cal Aeroservice Incorporated.
We have a crew of people here that are responsible for this restoration. There's about 6 people that work on it. We've worked on it for about 1 year and 3/4. We've had a very difficult time finding parts for it. So people like Lefty Gardner, Steve Hinton, Plains of Fame, Jack Erickson, and many, many others supplied most of the parts that we could peel away from them for this restoration.
After an outstanding restoration job, the P-38 was transported here to the Hill Aerospace Museum and placed on permanent display. The dedication of the Air Force Heritage Foundation in raising the money to recover the P-38 and the skill, knowledge, and strength of the recovery team all came together to bring this rare aircraft to the museum here in Utah. Americans can now view and learn about this piece of history that proudly defended our nation in her time of need.